Korean War veteran and also a POW for Korea. And then I gave him a couple of preps at dinner about having a funny story. So he's actually got, he says he has, a funny story even as a POW. And so if you can find a funny story from being a POW, it's worth listening to. With that, Leland, it's your show.
Turn it over to Major Rowley. Let him show his stuff.
Show my stuff.
Show your stuff.
That's the shortest introduction I've ever had. And that's fine. Whoops.
How y'all are?
I'm one of those rare natives of Arizona. I have lived 79 of my 84 years in Mesa. In fact, and I was telling Leland on the way over here, they came to pick me up at my house. My house today sits in the middle of a 20-acre farm that I grew up on.
Wow.
So I haven't gotten very far from home. In the Stapleton southern area in Mesa, I did all my schooling in Mesa. In fact, I was born, though, in Phoenix, 2 blocks from the state capitol, 1500 West Jackson, if you know anything about downtown Phoenix.
Mm-hmm.
In a home there, my father was working at Central Avenue Dairy at the time. My mother was expecting me. As an infant, though, we moved back over to Mesa. All my siblings were born in Mesa. And I appreciate the Arizona native pin that I got from Rabina this evening, and the dinner. I'm ready to take a nap, speaking, after that fine dinner. So I graduated from Mesa High School in 1948, immediately enlisted in the United States Regular Army. Went to basic at Fort Ord, California, came home for 30-day leave, sent to Okinawa for 15 months, 49 and 50. Came back from Okinawa in late April of 1950, assigned to Fort Lewis, Washington, the 2nd Infantry Division, 2nd Engineer Combat Battalion. May of 1950, what happened the next month? Korean War broke out, and I'll talk more about that. And I was on my way back to the Orient again within 2 months. I was heading back. Left July 17th out of the port of Tacoma, Washington on a slow ship. It took us 2 weeks to get to Korea. Got there on the 31st of July, 1950. Immediately went into action. The 2nd Engineer Battalion's major role was engineer activities such as building them and then blowing them up if you needed to. I'm talking about bridges, etc. And when we got there, we were almost sent into my company was there with the 1st contingent of the 2nd Division, along with battalion of the 9th Infantry and some associated units. We immediately, within a week, were in the front lines. Engineers were committed the first time, and 2 more times after that, up till 1st of December. Now, I won't go into any detail about that, but just understand that when combat engineers were needed, they were used, and we were used 3 times at some very critical times during the Korean War. Now, going into combat is a pretty scary thing, and anybody that says they're not scared when they go into combat, they're lying. Even the bravest. You know, courage. How does courage define? It's not the absence of fear, it's the mastery of it. And many times, men and women of our armed forces throughout the history of our nation have showed great courage. And I know of many instances as well. I make this presentation to high school American history classes. And it's a lesson that I learned both in military service as a prisoner of war and in later life. That we have to know and understand an enemy That's one of the cardinal rules of intelligence. In fighting any kind of war, you need to know your enemy. And we have an enemy amongst us. It's under the, and I'll talk a lot more about this socialism business. Okay, next. I have a threefold objective for you folks this evening: to take a brief historical look at Korea, and to look at the Korean War somewhat, up to my experience in it, and with some POW experiences mixed in there, and a comparison of socialism and capitalism relating to Korea today. And I think you'll be impressed, if you don't already know, about the Republic of Korea today. Next. Now, Korea historically has been a route of invasion through two countries. What do you suppose two countries? Japan and China. You see, it's a 600-mile-long peninsula sticking down between the Sea of Japan and the Yellow Sea, between Japan and China. Now, this particular map happens to show the extent of the Japanese invasion during World War II. Look how much of China they took, Mongolia included. So, Korea being here in the middle of these two countries were an invasion route through history, and oftentimes were dominated by other countries. Now, from 1910 until 1945, Korea was dominated by Japan. It became a state that really the people couldn't do what they desired to do because the Japanese rule was so heavy-handed. Okay, what happened in 1945 then that released them from the domination of Japan?
World War II.
World War II ended, yes. And since this was controlled by Japan, and since the Soviet Union declared war on Japan about a week before they surrendered, they felt they had the right to come into Korea and occupy, and they came into the north part. Let's go to the next one. They came into the north part of Korea, and the United States went into the southern part. Now, there was an effort to unify Korea. There were supposed to be elections held. The United Nations were supposed to supervise them. North Korea by that time it was under the heavy hand of a man named Kim Il-sung, whom the Soviet Union supported. And he set up a communist dictatorship there and refused to allow free elections. So those elections never occurred, and they arbitrarily divided Korea into about half along the 38 degrees north latitude, more commonly known as the 38th parallel. So we have North Korea, we have South Korea now, and still divided. A nation that wasn't divided during Japanese domination, but that is now divided. And many people in the north, no people in the south, and they're completely cut off from each other. During the next few years, tensions grew between these two countries. And I'm going to tell you this evening about some contradictions that occurred. Very early in my experience as a POW, I'm going to point something out where this is proven true. The very names of these two countries, especially the one in the north, is a contradiction. It's calling white black and black white. What is the name of that country? Democratic People's Republic of Korea. It's a bunch of nonsense. It certainly isn't democratic. The people are not important. They are not a republic, but they are Korea. And that's the only way the name fits. So here is calling white black and black white, because under socialism, freedoms are very few. And I'll point some more out as we go along. But look at South Korea, the Republic of Korea. Are we a republic here in the United States? We certainly are. We are not a democracy. We are a republic. Republic of representative kind of government. And sometimes I question that. Okay. Capital of Pyongyang is the capital of North Korea. Seoul is the capital of South Korea. Okay, let's have the next one. Tensions are building up On June 25th of 1950, the North Koreans, with the blessing of the Soviet Union, what is the Soviet USSR? Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Okay. So we have the under the sponsorship or the support of the Soviet Union, North Korea invades South Korea on the 25th of June, 1950. They immediately moved rapidly to the south. Next one. But I want to talk about this monument just a little bit before I go on, because I want you to understand how I feel about my service in Korea. This monument in Washington, D.C. is to the memory of all Korean War veterans, both who gave their lives and who are living. And I've had the privilege of visiting this several times. And you can tell where the location of the memorial is. This is the Lincoln Memorial right here. So if you know the location of that, you know where. It's just as you look at the Lincoln Memorial is off to the left. The Vietnam Memorial is off to the right, in about the same location. Now, this monument has 19 8-foot stainless steel statues representing a squad of American soldiers, or American servicemen, I should say, because there's a Marine, a Navy, Army, and Air Force all represented amongst these figures. Why would you have all of those? Well, because the Marine Corps is part of the fighting force. The Marine Corps does not have medics. All Marine Corps medics are naval corpsmen. The Air Force is represented by forward air controllers, FACs, who are up to the front and direct aircraft on the targets for the fighting forces. Okay. So all four branches here. The Coast Guard is not represented because the Coast Guard didn't participate in the Korean War, but they did a lot, of course, concerning our own coasts. Okay, let's have the next one, I think. Yeah. The slogan for the Korean War Veterans Memorial is "Freedom is not free," and if anything there is nothing more true than that. Freedom is not free. There's been a lot of sacrifice, a lot of money spent, but more importantly, a lot of lives given for our freedoms. In front of the lead statue is this plaque. Next. Our nation's uniformed sons and daughters answered their country's call to defend a country they did not know and a people they had never met. Nothing was truer. Most American servicemen, when you said, "Oh, the communists attacked South Korea," they said, "Where's Korea?" So the location of that, and you probably could ask school students today, and very, very few of them even know where Korea is today, let alone back then. But anyway, I was privileged to be one of these uniformed sons, to go there and to defend that nation. And as my talk unfolds to you, you're going to see what a remarkable nation that the Republic of Korea became. Okay, let's have the next one here. Now I'm going to just give you a brief look at the invasion, the repelling of the invasion and so forth. On June 25th, North Korean forces invaded South Korea and pushed quickly down into this corner of the Korean peninsula. This was called the Pusan Perimeter, and when I got to Korea, that's how much we held of Korea. Now, they very quickly, after the invasion started, next slide, T-34 Russian tanks were rumbling through Seoul, the capital of South Korea. And they pushed, and next one please, and they pushed down to that small corner. We had about 50 miles by 50 mile radius there around Pusan, port city. Thank heavens we still had Pusan as a port to bring in supplies. We came into Pusan and went immediately into the lines, as I already mentioned to you. Now, General MacArthur was making some plans that were really, really questioned by the high-ranking brass of our military. He said, I'd like to make an amphibious landing in Incheon. Incheon has 30-foot tides. But he figured it out, that he and his staff figured out precisely how and when the invasion could take place, and it was a great success. So they took troops from this area and still some that were in Japan. We had occupational forces still in Japan from World War II. They took them around and invaded amphibious landing at Incheon. The troops moved quickly inland, and at that same time we were able to break out of the Spooson perimeter. And as we did, we immediately noticed some terrible things that had happened to some of our soldiers who had become prisoners of war. Instead of the next one. This is 36 American soldiers who were murdered, their hands tied behind their backs by North Korean communist troops. I'll show you one up closer. I hope this isn't too undesirable, the next one. You can clearly see the hands tied behind the back with wire. And as we pushed on further, my division pushed to the west and over to a town called Cheonju. And the next slide is what was found at Cheonju. Hundreds of Korean civilians murdered by the communist forces as they withdrew. As we advanced and they withdrew. Their intention, I'm sure, was to cover this grave, but they didn't have time, and so this is what was found. Next one. Now, very quickly, this invasion took place on the 15th of September. By the end of September, we had taken all of South Korea back. And we were resting or halted along the 38th parallel. My battalion was in Yeongdong-po, just south part of Seoul at the time. And the decision was made then to invade North Korea for two purposes. One, to finish the destruction of what was left of the North Korean Communist Army. Number two, to unify the country. Since it wasn't done by elections earlier, not allowed by the communists, we were determined to unify the nation of Korea. So we quickly, on about the middle of October, we moved quickly up into North Korea. And as our forces came up to this area, it's getting in October and November, and it's getting colder and colder. Korea in 1950 had a 100-year summer. We had men dropping like flies from heat exhaustion in July and early August. When it became wintertime, it was just the opposite. We were freezing to death. But that being said, we had pushed, you can see this dotted line here, we had pushed that far into North Korea. Here's the border between North Korea and China right here. It's the Yalu River and the Tumen River over here on this side. Where you can see we had forces right on the Yalu at one point. My division was over in this area. We were fighting a battle along the western side of the peninsula. And let me tell you a little bit about the weather. The last 5 days of November, I remember standing there eating my Thanksgiving dinner in my mess kit. 23rd of November. And then about the 25th, the temperatures started plummeting. It was 0 degrees. The temperature in the next 5 days plummeted to 40 degrees below zero. Some of you may have been in temperatures that cold. Let me tell you, it's almost impossible to do anything. Can you imagine weapons freezing up? Can you imagine men become frostbitten, frozen, and so forth? But this is what occurred because it is terrible. They had to pick 1950 to have a 100-year summer and 100-year winter. But we could barely operate in those circumstances. But operate we did. We had to carry out our missions. We had to do the things that had to be done. We had to move. We had to shoot. We had to communicate. That sounds like the artillery, doesn't it? Move, shoot, communicate. Right. Leland and I were in the Arizona National Guard Same battalion for quite a few years, back in the 1960s, 60s and early 70s. Well, let's see, where was I?
Freezing, yeah.
Freezing. Oh,
Where'd it go?
I mean, it was cold. It was really, really cold. It was really, really cold.
How cold was it?
I thought you'd never ask. It was so cold that you could spit and it would freeze before it hit the ground. It was so cold that the oil in the engines of the vehicles would turn to jelly if you didn't leave the engines running continuously. It was so cold that if I touched a metal object with my hand, it would stick there. You know, like the tongue on the flagpole in the Christmas story.
When you pulled out, the skin tore right up your hand.
It was so cold. What's your name?
Dean.
Dean, it was so cold that if you were talking to me, that the words would come out of your mouth all frozen. I had to take them, put them in a pot of hot water and thaw them out before you could hear what you said. Yeah, like you don't do that. Well,
Doesn't even get 70 below, isn't that bad?
you wanted humor.
Yeah,
I know 10,000 comedians out of work and this guy's trying to be funny. You know?
I have one, I've never seen this done, but you can get to temperatures that are so low, you can take a hammer to a rubber tire and break it up.
Yeah. It wasn't quite that cold. It has to get a little colder than that. Yeah, but rubber is amazing, the temperature. But anyway.
70 below, it sticks to the ground. Though.
Okay, now, the Chinese communists up here became, oh, I want to read you something. It's a much more serious nature than this. In these terribly cold circumstances, there's a man named Dan Fearon wrote his feelings about when he went to Korea and some of the things he learned about the cold. He says, Memorial Day has more meaning to me because of this story. When is Memorial Day? Last Monday in May. Okay. He said, I served with the 23rd Regimental Combat Team, 2nd Division, during the Korean War. That's my division, by the way. The unit I joined had gone to Korea in August 1950. They had been as far north as Kunuri before being driven south by the Chinese. In December 1950, I became a replacement for someone who was killed or wounded. Members of the squad that I became a part of told me something they had seen near Kunuri. By the way, I'm reading this story to honor all 36,000 U.S. servicemen that gave their lives in Korea during the Korean War. This is one story out of 36,000. So I honor all those 36,000 by this one story. They said that they came across a dead American soldier. He had been wounded and was frozen in the snow. They said he died with a frozen tear on his cheek. I have often thought of this scene and the American soldier. The question that always comes to mind is, what were his thoughts as he lay dying? Were his thoughts the cause of the tear? Was he having a conversation with God? Was he thinking about his girlfriend back home? Were his thoughts of his mother or a baby born since he left the States? His baby. Was it the pain and the cold that caused the tear to slip down his cheek? I have always thought of this soldier as a hero. He died alone on a hill so far away from home. As he lay dying, no loved one held his hand or said, I love you. His cries of medic went unanswered. He did not have a nurse in a clean, crisp uniform, wrapped a blanket around him and tucked it in gently for warmth and comfort. No medical aid was given. He fought his last skirmish alone in this strange land. When I honor Memorial Day, I am honoring a dead American soldier on a Korean hill, a soldier with a frozen tear on his cheek. You know, when I give this to some of the high school classes, yeah, I can look down there There's nothing humorous about it, but it's a happy thing that we can become emotional. Does that make sense? We become emotional about things that are really touching to us. And laughing and crying are so close together. You cry when you're extremely sad, you cry when you're extremely happy. And that soldier's tear on his cheek was for a different reason, because he was so terribly
Probably cold, yeah.
cold.
Yeah.
And certainly if a man was wounded and wasn't taken care of immediately and he couldn't move, and within a half hour to an hour he was frozen in those circumstances. Now, I'm trying to think of a good place I can take a break here and tell you about that stuff that I put over there. Maybe I'll do that now. Do you mind if I regress? Something I meant to tell you at the beginning. The photograph you see here is my dear wife. She's at age 40. I met Ruth Martin very shortly after I got home from Korea. That in itself is to me the most beautiful love story there ever was, how I met her and the circumstances, but I can't go into detail now. But suffice it to say, I dated her 2 weeks and proposed marriage, and she said yes without hesitation. We were married for 57 years, and she passed away after a 20-year battle with cancer on the 8th of February of 2011. And the reason the photo is here is because I dedicate this presentation to her, as well as all servicemen and women, both serving and those who gave their lives. The river, that completely overwhelmed us by numbers. Some of you may have heard about human wave tactics. That's exactly what happened. They came at us with so many numbers, they just absolutely engulfed you, so to speak. And on December 1st, the situation was very, very critical, and many men were both killed, wounded, all three killed, wounded, or taken prisoners. Now, the 2nd Engineer Battalion, for the 3rd time, had been placed into the lines, front lines, to fight. And we were defending some hills that were protecting our division rear headquarters. And we stayed there. We had to stay there until it was critical, and eventually, just within a couple of days, we were overwhelmed. The 2nd Division had been left as a rear guard action. When the Chinese hit all of our forces so hard, we had to withdraw. And when you withdraw, any military force, you must leave a rear guard in place to keep the enemy occupied so the other forces can get south, set up a new defense, and then the rear guard can withdraw. Well, by the time it was the 2nd Division's turn to withdraw, it was impossible. But mountain passes had been blocked either by knocked out vehicles or fire blocks shooting down on them so intensely that we couldn't move. And we had a 6-mile long gauntlet of the 2nd Division vehicles that were being fired on from the ridges on both sides. There were 5,000 casualties the last 5 days of November in the 2nd Division. That's 1/3 of the division's strength. Because my battalion had been the rear guard, the rear of the rear guard. Now here's a combat engineer battalion fighting a rear guard action because the 23rd Infantry, who was the rear guard, pulled out and went down a coastal road, and that left my engineer battalion completely exposed. So we lost 95% of our equipment. We probably 320 of our battalion became prisoners of war, and a like number were killed. And at a battalion formation on the 10th of December, 10 days later, down in Yongdong-po, the place we had joined and stayed for a while and then invaded on north. Battalion was formed, and out of an 888-man battalion, there were 266 men in the formation. So it was a disastrous thing for both the 2nd Division and my battalion. I became a prisoner of war on the morning of December 1st, exactly 4 months to the day that I arrived in Korea. We had gone through 3 combat actions up to that time. Now it's a really what's the word? Traumatic experience. For 1 second, you're shooting at this guy we call an enemy. The next second, you're at his complete mercy, and not knowing what's going to happen. Now, don't you think we thought back to July and August, what I showed you happened to those prisoners?
Yeah.
Well, thank heavens the Chinese communists who took us prisoners were not that brutal. They had some other things in mind for us that I'm going to tell you about in a little bit. But anyway, we marched away from the front lines with our captors. Let's see, I think I want to show the next one. Oh, this is the clothing I had on. Not that actual clothing, but somebody said, "Oh, did you bring all your clothes home?" I said, "No, they wore out at the POW camp." But anyway, I had a cotton undershirt, wool undershirt, fatigue jacket, a pile jacket, a field jacket, and an overcoat which had a blanket lining. From the waist down I had shorts, long johns, 2 pairs of trousers. My feet I had heavy wool socks, combat boots, and these rubber overshoes. Now I tell you this to help you understand, and I was still cold, and in that bitter temperature. I think I want you to go to the next one, which is blanket. Oh no, it isn't here. Okay, this is a group of POWs shortly after I was taken a prisoner, and that's me right there. I ran across this photograph many years after I came home, and it was rather startling to see it. But anyway, this is 2 communist guards here watching over us. Okay, the next one. And this is a group of POWs marching and walking and overseen by communist Chinese guards. Now, I'm going to tell you a story about those overshoes and combat boots that I was wearing. The 21 nations provided troops to help fight the Korean War. One of them was Turkey. The Turkish brigade had arrived in Korea recently and were within the front lines with us, and many of them were captured as well. About 10 nights into our march in this bitter cold, trying to half carry, half drag our wounded and those who couldn't walk for other reasons, diseases of malnutrition kicking in almost right away because almost nothing to eat, we were able to make a night's march and then put into buildings for the daytime so we'd be out of the sight of American aircraft. So about 10 nights into our march, somebody came up to me and said, "Rowley, take a look at this Turkish soldier's feet." Next one. These are the kind of boots that I had on. Now, turn on the next one then now. Turkish soldier had a pair of boots like this on. He didn't have the extra protection that I had. And he had gotten his feet wet. They were crossing a half-frozen stream or something. And his feet were swelling, frozen and swelling. And he cut 3 long slits in each toe of the boots. And his feet were actually swelling out the slits of the toe, in the toes of his boots. And they were red and sore, and he could hardly walk. And this person, this buddy who called that to my attention said, "Rowley, would you give this Turkish soldier your overshoes?" And I said, "Certainly." And so I don't know how we got his boots off him. I mean, we probably had to cut them off some way. But then the next one. So you just ruined my story now. Don't you feel bad about that?
Yeah,
Go
it's
back.
horrible. I'm trying to go back. There we go. Oh. All right, there's a delay. I'm gonna push it.
Okay, there you go. Thank you. Appreciate that. So, since this turkey soldier's feet are probably about that long, you know, these things are large enough to go over other boots. He probably would have taken 2 steps while they took 1. If he had, so we found some old rags and we wrapped up his feet large enough so they fit comfortably inside these overshoes. What happened next was completely unexpected. He was so grateful. He literally kneeled down in front of me and kissed my feet. Turkish tradition, I don't know, showing gratitude. And I was really emotional myself. Now, I simply did what I needed to do for a fellow soldier. I didn't expect any kind of reward, any kind of recognition. I just simply wanted to help him. But he showed such gratitude that it was really overwhelmed me. Now, you may not, who this guy to say, and now the rest of the story? Paul Harvey? That is the end of the story. A few nights later, a Chinese guard came up to me with his rifle, pointed it at me, and jabbered something in Chinese, and then pointed it at my boots. Is there any mistaking what he wanted? And at first I said, "Oh, no." And he said, "Oh, yes." So I gave up my boots to him, and he gave me an old worn-out pair of shoes that he had. Now, at this point, I thought, well, I'm really in trouble now, because there have men who had, in spite of the protection they had their feet frozen. Most were not as fortunate as me. I had these overshoes and combat boots on. Some of them didn't have that much protection, but I had lost what I felt was 2 layers of protection. I said, boy, I really had it now. But you know what? 2 more weeks of marching at night, and I made it to the first POW camp with only slight frostbite. Somebody was watching after me, I know. But let me tell you about a sergeant, Sergeant Treffery. All 10 of his toes were completely frozen. All 10 of his toes went through the stages of frozen feet. First a very, very bright red, and then turning brown, and then turning black, and then the flesh sloughing off the bones. He had 10 bones sticking out the ends of his feet. What to do about it? We had no medical care, we had no medicine, we had nothing. But there was a, quote, Chinese nurse who took pity on this sergeant and found a pair of these. And without any kind of anesthesia, literally chopped the bones of his toes of his feet off. Sounds, can you imagine the excruciating pain?
I don't think it'd be pain.
He saved his life, is what he did.
He saved his life. He did survive. He did go on and make the rest of the marches, and he came home in the prison exchange the same time I did, in 1953. Is freedom free? No sacrifice. Let's try the next slide so I remember what I was supposed to say. Oh, this guy. For some reason, I was putting some blanks in between. And looks like they didn't show up on my slide. That's supposed to be, pretend that's a blank slide, would you? Okay. On the 24th of December, it seemed like an especially cold night because it was Christmas Eve, we walked in we were, we were singing some Christmas carols, and our meal that night was a wooden bowl of dirty water with corn, whole kernel corn floating in it. And it seemed extra cold because of the nostalgias that we have had, the memories of Christmas and so forth. But then we all were able to sleep. Let me tell you something about that sleep. This is supposed to be the funny part, Bill.
Okay.
Not very funny, really, but funny. Does that make sense? Okay, we were crammed into rooms like sardines. I mean, we were like this. And we had to sleep within the curve of the guy's body next to us, right here, like this, you see.
Spooning.
It was impossible for one man to turn over. And when the first guy who couldn't stand that hard mud floor against his hip bone, which was not as fleshy as it was earlier, when he couldn't stand it any longer, he says, "I have to turn over." So the whole room then would turn over to the other side. And then later in the night, when somebody else couldn't stand it any longer, "I've got to turn over." And we all turned over to the other side. We kind of laughed about that, even in these dire circumstances. So, okay. We got to, we walked into our first POW camp on Christmas morning. It became known as Death Valley because in the next 2.5 weeks or so, about 250 to 300 men died. Diseases of malnutrition, dysentery, pellagra, beriberi, pneumonia was 100% fatal with no kind of medications. The communists came to us one day during this 2.5 weeks and said, "We want you to come down to this schoolhouse and listen to a lecture." Now by this time, the men's tobacco habits have gotten the best of some of them because our tobacco ration was cut off. I didn't have any problem because I didn't smoke. But some men had an extra monkey on their back because of that nicotine habit. So they had an extra difficult time maybe adjusting. The communists said to us, "If you will come to this lecture, we will give you 1 leaf of tobacco." Well, I wasn't interested. But the guy next to me, I don't even remember his name, he's small in stature. Remember, we were in here like this.
Mm-hmm.
He was so sick he couldn't get up. He said, "Rowley, would you go to that lecture for me and get that leaf of tobacco?" And this man do that. Wilfred Burchett gave the lecture. Our first taste of communist indoctrination. Now he spouted off about how the glorious communist forces were pushing the United Nations forces in the ocean down at Pusan. Well, they didn't get anywhere near Pusan in their invasion. So what is black, white, and white, black? It was our first indoctrination, and it's just the opposite of what the truth really is. Wilfred Burchett was known quite well around the POW camp system during the time I was a prisoner of war. We had seen him first here in this POW camp, but GIs have a way of giving names to people. Can you guess? So Mr. Burchett became Mr. Burchett became Mr. Bird. You know what I say? Anyway, thought I'd throw it. Hope you young people didn't mind that. Okay, our first communist indoctrination. It was the first of many, many, many. Let's look at the next one. After 2.5 weeks or so in that Death Valley, we moved, we marched 6 more days, days time this time, to this POW camp. It was right on the Yalu River, the backwaters of the Yalu River. There was a series of hydroelectric dams along the river that backed up like lakes here, like this. This is Pyukton, camp number 5, my second POW camp. And here an organized system of lectures and indoctrinations began. And we were required to attend them, to listen, to discuss questions afterwards back in our rooms, and to give the kind of answers that they wanted. We call them commie-pleasing answers. And we answered those questions quickly, precisely, to get it out of the way so we could talk about the thing that was on our mind the most, food. We would cook up the most delicious meals you can imagine in our minds and to describe them to our fellow POWs. And this went on day after day, and we would simply use our time getting the answers written down. And when the communist instructor came and collected them, oh, very good, very good answers. You know. The lectures continued day after day, 7 days a week, sometimes such as a lecture and discussion and so forth, 8 hours a day. And this went on for 16 months.
Wow.
Lectures like capitalism versus socialism, free enterprise versus, well, socialism. The glories of communist leaders. And throughout this entire winter, the men were continuing to die. And at this POW camp, this next one, the lectures continued. And I think I was over here somewhere. But this is, of course, in the summertime. The ice on the Yalu River, this lake, 3 feet thick. 3 feet. You could have driven a 60-ton tank over it, Bill, and it wouldn't have cracked it. So throughout the winter, men continued to die in great numbers. And we arrived at this camp the 26th of January, 1951, still bitterly cold, and men continued to die, and we had to do something with the bodies. But we didn't have to do anything right away because we would simply stack them like cordwood. They were in deep freeze storage. And every few days we'd take a trek over to the other side, across the ice, over either on these hills or over here, and try to bury them. We'd scratch out a grave maybe the size of their body, this deep, this wide, and whatever the length of their body. With the crude tools in the frozen ground, at least frozen that deep as the Yalu was thick. And so we buried our buddies as best we could. And all the time expressing to us in these lectures the glories of this communist socialist system that we're supposed to embrace. Black is white and white is black. There was a poem written, and the author, we don't know which POW wrote this, but it has to be one of the ones that were right there with us in this camp, because the description is pretty much like I just told you. This is called A Time to Remember. Not a bugle was heard, not a funeral beat, nor even a drum sounding retreat, as over the ice the corpses were carried to that hill where our GIs were buried. 6 feet by 2 feet and 1 foot deep. In a Korean hill they sleep, Both young and old, perhaps one wonders why these 1,600 had to die. You know then the number in the next 2.5 or 3 months or so that gave their lives. No little white crosses to bear their names, but they were not buried in shame. Although they lie in unknown graves, they were 1,600 American brave. There were no useless caskets to enclose their breast, only GI clothing for their last rest. All colors of men, black, brown, and white, now 1,600 faded lights. A pill, a powder, or a medicine of any kind may have saved them from that yonder hill, those 1,600 now laying still. In their illness, tossing and turning, most of them knew there would be no returning. Some went easy, but most in pain. Did these 1,600 die in vain? For those of us who may go back to enjoy life's fill, they will still be there on that lonely hill. Forgotten by some, yet remembered by most, they will be the 1,600 at their last post. Thus I honor all who died in the POW camps. Can any of you think of this is probably a pretty religious group, isn't it? Can you think of a scripture that describes what I've told you, black is white and white is black? Isaiah 5:20. Now, I mean, it tells us right here, listen. Woe unto them that call evil good and good evil. Put darkness for light and light for darkness. Put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. It's in the book. So these lectures telling us, let's see the next slide here. Into the warmer part, we were able to have these lectures outside. And the communist instructor would get up there and harangue for a few hours about all these things that I've mentioned to you. And then we were expected, as I said, to go back to our rooms and discuss questions that they gave us. And we gave them the commie-pleasing answers until a certain point. Then rebellion took place and things changed. But I don't have time to tell you the details of that. But in the next slide, you know who these guys are? Who's this? Karl Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin, Mao Zedong, Chinese communist leader. Told the glories of these people's lives and how they were working for the working class and so forth and so forth. And we really got to the point where we were sick and tired of it. And the lectures, after so many months, maybe 8 months or so, they started deteriorating. We knew by then that they weren't going to kill us because they wanted to make little commies out of us. By this time, 50% of the men in the POW camps had died. In around July of 1951, the deaths decreased dramatically. Why? Because a certain event started in Korea. It was called peace negotiations, where the UN side and the communist side came together and tried to end the war. It took them 2 years to accomplish that. And when they talked, the peace talks were broken off several times because the end of the war, upper left, Seoul, Korea today. Next one. This is, can we turn that light off now? You have that, cadet? This will give you a better, okay. This tells the story. Republican kind of government, free government in the South. Free enterprise, the North, socialism, hardly any freedoms. This tells the whole story and the whole message this evening just in this one photograph. And yet we have people in high positions of government today, starting with the man in the White House, who are trying to take us toward socialism. It has failed everywhere it's been tried. It's not only failed economically, it has failed its people. And I'm going to show you quickly some additional slides here. This is the root of part of the problem right now. And the next one, does this remind you of some kind of salute that we saw during World War II?
Oh, yeah.
And does this next one remind you of the goose-stepping Nazis?
I didn't see Arden in the photo.
All under the control. Now look at the precision.
Yeah, where that guy's.
This is a little North Korean orphan boy. The human rights record for North Korea is abysmal. Next one. Another little guy, even though he seems to be warm, he's got problems. And the next one. In February of 2014, articles came out galore about human rights in North Korea. These are some of the photos that came out of North Korea. Little children. If you want to know the condition of any country anywhere, you look at the children. And opposed to that, the little South Korean children that I saw on a trip. Next one, in 2013. The next one. I don't have the time to tell you the story of the flag. If you want it, buy one of my books. So I guess that's it.
Okay. The one slide, go ahead, you can turn the light back on.
Can I tell that story?
Yeah, you can go ahead and tell that story.
I need to tell this story.
We're not renting the room. We're getting the room for free. But go ahead and tell the story.
Okay, I was in 5 POW camps. Death Valley, 5, went to 3, that's where I got my first letter, and then I went to 2. A bunch of us who were recalcitrant troublemakers, they called us, removed off, isolated. And then just a couple of months before the armistice was signed, they broke up that camp and moved me to Camp 1. So I was in 5 POW camps. When I was in Camp 2, my 4th camp, we had no idea that there was an officers' camp so close to us, about 6 miles away. The communists came to us one day, and by this time, because of the negotiations that are taking place, food is a lot better. The deaths have stopped. We've gained a lot of our weight and our strength back. They couldn't afford to send a bunch of walking human skeletons home at the time they had exchanged prisoners. Therefore, weight and strength, and they gave us athletic equipment. Said, we want you to organize basketball, baseball, volleyball teams, and we're going to let you go to your officers' camp. We thought, what officers' camp? So the time came, I made the volleyball team. The time came, our troop walked that 6 miles to the officers' camp, and I saw then, for the first time in 2 years, my battalion commander, who, by the way, had ordered our colors burned that disastrous night so they wouldn't be captured by the communists to use as a trophy of war. And to this day, our battalion, which is now stationed in White Sands Missile Range, by the way, has a burning the colors ceremony to commemorate that night. Now, where was I before I regressed? These 2 days we spent at the officers' camp are memorable, not because of the athletic contest that took place, but because of an event that happened the second night. A few of us enlisted men were sitting around just shooting a bull, and with some of the officers, and the door opened from the outside, and it was pitch black outside. An officer stuck his head and he said, "Follow me," whispered, "Follow me." So we went out into the dark of the night and passed between several buildings in POW camp and ended up in the dark, completely dark camp kitchen. There was a table in the middle of it, and they said, gather around this table. And so we did, about 7 of us enlisted men along with quite a few officers there. And we wondered, what in the world's going on here anyway? And then an officer reached up and pulled the switch. It was a cake, similar to this one, on the table. It was signed. The Korean War is still the Korean War. there is no peace treaty. Technically, it's still a war. And I resent President Truman called it a police action. And later they called it a Korean conflict. Finally, I think Congress passed a law quite a few years ago that called it the Korean War.